It's time we have a completely different conversation around this cost issue. Now, National Treasury has identified it as a top priority. It's saying, if we're going to get value for members, we've got to rethink the costs. And I agree, it's highly important. But we're having the wrong conversations. And let me give you an example. Yesterday, I was talking to a trustee, and he said something completely sensible. He said, I'm perfectly prepared to pay top dollar for a fund manager who gives me top performance. Now, in all our context of understanding costs and value and cost and benefit, that sounds sensible, doesn't it? But let me explain the problem differently. And I'm not going to get into the issue of whether or not past performance is any indicator of whether a fund manager can deliver in the future. I want to really talk about the whole economics of running a pension fund and what that economic structure means to the value that a member gets at the end. So let's turn the discussion around and ask the question, what is it that contributes most to the outcomes for members? And more importantly, what destroys the ride? So let's go back to our fund manager situation and think about it. If you look over the course of a 40-year investment period, which is pretty much what most people in a pension fund will experience, by the end of that 40 years, you have paid probably 80% of your costs to an asset manager. Your problem is this. That asset manager may be delivering top performance, but the member sits at the end of that ride, and they're sitting there with a replacement ratio that is a fraction of what it should be. So instead of a 75% replacement ratio, they're sitting there with a 32% replacement ratio. What's going wrong? And the answer isn't the cost of the asset manager. The answer isn't the performance of the asset manager. The answer of where that value destruction is taking place is coming from somewhere else. And let's understand the whole picture so we can get to the right thinking around costs. Where does value get destroyed in that equation? It gets destroyed first and foremost by the members' choices. Do they preserve? Did they pick the right contribution rates? Did they pick the right pensionable pay? Oddly enough, that same trustee that I was talking to, when I said, okay, what is your biggest problem in the fund? He said, my problem is my members aren't doing the right thing. My structure isn't right. They're picking conservative investments when they should be. So I said, so you're prepared to pay top dollar for an asset manager, but actually the value that your member is getting isn't being driven by that performance. It's being driven by the way your fund is structured. And who's got that job? And the answer to our problem is going to be to create a whole new concept, both on the consulting side and on the asset management side. How does that work? Well, in a sense, to get it right on the consulting side is almost the same argument that you would use to get good financial planning right. Unless you have someone, and I'm going to call this person an Uber consultant, who can look holistically at the problem, who can look at all the different parts in the value chain that it takes to get from that member making that first contribution meaningful to having that outcome also be meaningful. That is the trick in getting the value. So we need to change how we think about the consulting side, but we equally need to change our thinking about the asset management side. Because here's the harsh truth. Over a 40-year period, it actually doesn't matter who your fund manager is. The markets giveth and the markets taketh performance. What you need is rather to get some very consistent delivery of a targeted outcome that matches what sort of requirements you have, your liabilities, as it were, for your members, not are you the top performing fund? And to do that, we need to take two important issues off the table. We need to take performance off the table, because performance isn't about being the top performer. It's about being the performer who can match what you require. And we need to take costs off the table. We do not need to pay huge fees to fund managers to get what members need over time. We need to get the structure of the fund right, we need to get the decision making right, and then with those two things in place and the costs under control and the costs evenly distributed among your value chain, then the cost-benefit equation works. I've put some fairly radical ideas on the table, so I want to be really crystal clear what we're trying to say here. And it's not that we're trying to say that asset managers shouldn't try to perform. That's perfectly fine in a space where people have surplus capital, surplus money, and they can go and take that money and invest in a unit trust and hope that they get best performance. What we're saying is that that horse race, essentially, doesn't belong in the long-term savings space. It doesn't belong in the retirement fund space, because there you have the value of time being able to deliver the performance, not the value of the fund manager's extra performance. The other thing that we're saying is that we're not trying to take money away from fund managers. We're simply trying to say that fund managers can actually deliver what we require at far less aggressive and risky sort of strategies at far less cost. We're not saying go passive either, because we do believe there is a risk and return trade-off that you get from active management that's quite valuable. But the most important message of all that we're saying is that when you take performance fees, when you take the horse race off the table, when you control costs on the asset management side, it doesn't translate into the ultimate value to the member unless you can also coordinate that with that Uber consultant model that can look at the whole picture and can say, is it working? Is that member actually getting to where he needs to get to or she needs to get to? And do we understand what is destroying that journey? When we can put those two pieces together, we've got a winning answer for members. Right now, it's far too fragmented.